Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and my name is Evan McEachern, and welcome to the program. Today, we're discussing the plight of the American middle class, some of the causes of it, and what we can do to solve the problems that we face. The middle class has been imperiled. A quarter of middle-income families are fearful that they won't even be able to pay for basic necessities. 550,000 people were experiencing homelessness in the United States in 2016. The financial gap between middle-income and wealthy families is at its highest point in decades. Though Americans technically made more money in 2007 than previous generations in the 60s and 70s, they were often a third as well off, and usually supported by two incomes, rather than the single breadwinner of the mid-20th century. An Oxfam study estimates that approximately half of the world's wealth is controlled by only 8 billionaires. 8. What's worse is the people in our democratic society feel hopeless, that the representative system has failed them. And why shouldn't they? The myth of everyman grassroots candidates like the populists of old is simply dead. Of course, William Jennings Bryan was not a great candidate, the populists weren't great, but you know. The modern American sees a world where it costs $650 to become president and $1.2 billion to run a losing campaign. This exorbitant elitism simply furthers politicians from the common man they supposedly represent. I do believe, however, that we can wrest ourselves from this crisis and repair this broken system. But first, today I'd like to look into the causes of this current situation.
$1 million, $2 million, $3 million, $4
It's perhaps not shocking that we start this film talking about the oppressive boot of big business. The structure of modern companies is akin to the Gilded Age, with enormous monopolies dominating industries. Looking into the realm of media, for example, in 1980, 50 companies controlled 90% of America's media consumption. In 2011, the number had shrunk down to 6. That means the same company that shows your children this shows your teens this, and shows you this.
Welcome back to a special edition of Nightline as we're learning key details about the suspect in the attack on the Ariana Grande concert in Manchester, England. The question tonight, did he act alone?
And it's not just media. Across all industries, 2015 was a record year for mergers and acquisitions. But first, I want to draw a clear line between the modern monopolies and the trusts of old. Monopolies used to really be comically villainous. The way they made as much money as possible, as fast as possible, was openly victimizing consumers and employees. Price fixing, long-haul, short-haul abuse, selling obviously fake products. Because of this abuse, the government abandoned its laissez-faire attitude and passed legislation like the Clayton Antitrust Act to protect the people who actually make these companies their money. The Walmarts and Disneys of this world did not become titanic forces through outright abuse or some made-up New World Order. They grew because they provided a service that could not be matched by small-scale competitors. It's a national supermarket, a place where everyone in the country can get everything they need, at cheaper prices, in one central location. It doesn't matter that the company may be corrupt or treat its workers poorly. It's all technically legal, so why should it stop? Of course, corporations are still quite capable of scamming the consumer, with Apple selling phones built to break down when you download their new OS, or PCs being made from the ground up to not be modular. There's also a few key reasons why the US is losing companies to other nations. Everyone knows that American manufacturing has been torpedoed, that robotics and Chinese dominate the fields where humans once were, that 5 million manufacturing jobs have been lost over the past 17 years, that the devalued Chinese yuan has contributed to this massive loss of jobs, etc., etc. What I think is more interesting is the fairly new practice of inversion. This is when a company bases their HQ in another country to dodge American taxes. The company still makes the same products and conducts all the same business they would if they were still in America, and especially with modern communication technology, it's very easy. They just deal with less taxes. It's caused by our strange and unique policy called double taxation. In most countries, when you make revenue internationally, you pay that nation's taxes, and that's it. In the United States, you pay their taxes, then our taxes as well, on that net income. It's driven companies like Burger King and Medtronic to flee the states. This is a perspective on the American economy that I won't be taking for much of the video, but these top-level economic issues matter just as much as the low-level. The United States has always cultivated the biggest and most powerful corporations in the modern geopolitical world, and letting them use this as a launching platform before fleeing to Canada or Ireland is simply not acceptable. And one last thing. The tax structure in this country is outright nonsensical. Wages as a percent of GDP have dipped tremendously in the past 40 years, and corp profits have risen. Yet tax rates on individuals, those receiving those wages, has skyrocketed, especially compared to the low rates companies pay. Middle-class wages have been stagnant for decades. Just because the economy is growing for the obscenely wealthy does not necessarily mean a positive for you. I'd like to begin this segment by breaking down a few key facts about American small business. Mostly, that it's in poor shape. Businesses in the United States have never started up at a slow rate, nor grown at such rates when they do start. One study concluded that the technology needed to stay competitive is prohibitively expensive for the small business owner, where large corporations have funds to pay for acquisition, training, and maintenance cost. Research conducted by the OECD found that across most industrialized nations, the US had the least total firm births, as well as comparably low rates of small and medium-sized enterprises. Now, technically, self-employment has started to rise again in recent years, but this is not an objective good. Many self-employed workers are merely contractors, and that number has been going up. They're often paid better than regular employees, but have no benefits like health insurance or legal guarantees that a normal employee would have, and are forced to deal with legal issues themselves. These contracting agencies also don't usually provide competition for bigger fish in consumer-oriented fields, which is often the role of new companies. Government regulation has also played a significant role in quashing small business. 2/3 of small business owners claim the level of government overreach into business is confusing, and a similar number responded positively to the repeal of Obama's Affordable Care Act earlier this year. The amount of paperwork and legal jargon is manageable to companies that can afford staffs of lawyers, but a company of under 20 people should not have to deal with the same Dodd-Frank law that stretches on for nearly 1,000 pages with countless pertinent questions. The thing's a nightmare. I advise you check it out only if you enjoy the works of David Lynch or James Joyce.
Sir Tristram, Vieilleur de Maurice, brought over the short sea, had Passencourt re-arrived from North Armorica on this side the scraggy isthmus of Europe Minor to wheel to fight his Peninsulet war. Nor had Topsawyer's rocks by the stream Orkney exaggerated themselves to Lawrence County.
Both Republicans and Democrats continually stack new laws on top of old, while never retracting old policies, creating a Byzantine legal code that no one person could possibly hope to understand. The government seems to want a separate form for every possible event that could occur, right down to the number of crayons per box in a daycare in Colorado, while actually savvy economic minds exploit its convolution for loopholes. Furthermore, the very aspect of complying to these regulations can be a challenge. One Lafayette University study estimated that companies under 20 people paid about $3,000 additional per employee for cost of compliance when compared to companies over 499 employees. This has been especially problematic in rural areas. Non-urban areas have seen their business formation fall off a cliff. Approximately 20 counties in all of America supplied half the growth since the 2008 Depression simply by treading water. Less populated areas constituted less than 1 in 10 job recoveries in the country. The wealth of America has become concentrated in the cities, as rural Americans lacked the highly trained, skilled population to imitate startups generating wealth in Silicon Valley or other urban areas. Beyond rural America's anemic rate of startups, it is being left behind by the same companies that are sending their manufacturing process to China or India. In the 20th century, small towns across America's heartland were supported by agriculture, local businesses, or a factory established by a national corporation. As local prospects collapse and national chains find cheaper alternatives, these towns find themselves unable to recuperate. Urban areas have more involved service industries and government works, jobs that are accessible to a variety of skill levels. This system fails when the population drops to a certain point, as there is simply less demand for service. This lack of harmonious growth prevents the entire nation from truly rebuilding itself.
I've got good news to shout in your ears. The long-lost dollar has come back to the fold. With silver you can turn your dreams to gold. Oh, we're in the money, we're in the money. We've got a lot of what it takes to get along.
I can't deny that everything I've talked up to this point is a big problem on its own, but I think it's obvious that the number one source of these problems is government corruption. Throughout the history of the United States, 91% of presidents elected were the better financed candidates. As noticed before, politicians only reach their lucrative positions through extreme expenditures of wealth, and most Americans lack the hundreds of millions needed to finance a presidential campaign. Thus, these prospective politicians turn to the giving hands of philanthropic corporate leaders to promote their run for president. Oftentimes, candidates aren't even obliged to publicize who or what funds them. The Super PAC has grown in popularity over the past few election cycles, allowing candidates to receive potentially unlimited funding from undisclosed donors. The phenomenon reached its peak in the 2012 election cycle, when $812 million were cumulatively raised in support of both the GOP and the Democrats. Even once officials reach office, money rules the legislation process. One study analyzed 1,779 policy outcomes over 20 years and found that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have had substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy, while mass-based interest groups and average citizens have little to no independent influence. In 2004, American politicians spent $32.7 billion of federal money on local projects to better their own status. Lobbying has become a billion-dollar industry over the past 20 years, as leading corporations institute agents to push their interests on Washington over the will of the people. This is not merely a modern problem. Former President Woodrow Wilson once said on the issue that Washington has seldom seen a problem so numerous, so insidious, or so industrious as a lobby. The level of corruption that has pervaded Washington is outright despicable, and it is the strong influence of money that has most separated the common man from the people who supposedly represent him. The solution to this situation is not singular nor simple. Though the government has a substantial role to play, it cannot be the sole force for change. Legislation can solve individual problems, such as corporate inversion by matching America's corporate taxes with those of competitive nations, and rather than reducing complex issues down to the simplistic act of cutting or increasing taxes, the code can merely be simplified to accurately match the highest sources of income found in this country. Fortunately, steps have already been taken, as President Trump promises a plan rife with tax cuts for small businesses in his 2017 tax proposal. The U.S. has had an era of trust-busting before. Once again, it can grant teeth to legislation that prevents the imperial power of modern monopolies. None of these, however, will truly repair our economy. The onus is on the individual to make the world around him a better place. It is the individual who must reject lower pricing to support his neighbor, who must push for political candidates that will create reform, who must vote with his wallet to build the future he wants to see. The influence of flashy marketing campaigns must be cast off in favor of good common sense. Walmart or Apple are no less culpable than the trusts of old. They are simply far wiser. Lessons learned from this cartoonish villainy of old manipulate the public in a way no corporation could in the past. It is ironic that with the advent of the same smartphones Apple pioneered, it has never been easier to seek out the truth. Yet people are still as easily tricked. Mass-produced corporate products are sold as signifiers of uniqueness and social acceptance, more tokens of wealth than useful electronics.
You've got to think for yourselves. You're all individuals. Yes, we're all individuals. You're all different. Yes, we are all different.
Further, one must make an effort to buy American products. There is yet hope. By one estimate, America still makes 3/4 of what it consumes. Reinvigorating small business will be an even trickier task. The government can again play a role, reducing the crushing load of paperwork, or perhaps incentivizing companies to employ workers rather than contract labor. None of this matters, however, if the same common people who do not have a career now fail to rise to the occasion when legislation shifts. They themselves must put the work in and have creativity to carve out a niche in an ever-crowding market. Small business is a proven good for the economy. Many of the great behemoths that dominate the world now ironically began as small business operations. It is where the production world can abandon the platitudes of a stale market and take risks on different ideas, as there is simply less money to be lost. No one person can solve a catastrophic crisis on this scale. It demands only the collaborative efforts of an entire nation of inventive, hard-working people to reclaim their right to equality.